Our next speaker is Dr. Timothy Seiter of University of Texas at Tyler. Dr. Seiter is an assistant professor of history at UT Tyler, specializing in colonial Texas with an emphasis on Spanish and Native histories. He recently published a monograph with the University of Texas Press about life in 18th century Spanish Texas titled Wrangling Pelicans. I haven't seen that one yet. He also works with the Karankawa tribe of Texas, and his research on the Karankawas has appeared in Texas Monthly, the Texas Tribune, and Texas Highways. His paper this morning is A Paper Empire on Native Ground, Spanish and Indigenous Relations in the Colonial Texas. Please welcome Dr. Seiter.
Hello, everyone. Just give me a second or two. Okay, well, first off, I want to say thank you for having me. I want to say thank you to the organizers for putting all this together. And then also, I want to say thank you to all the people I've presented so far. I was here yesterday. Those presentations were phenomenal. The one we just heard was also phenomenal. So it's wonderful to see this symposium so active and presenting, or people presenting such wonderful research. So my name is Dr. Tim Seiter. I am an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Tyler, and today we're going to be learning how Texas was a native ground. So our roadmap for today is thus. First, we're going to be hearing a story that involves pelicans and a royal zoo. Then we're going to pivot into the Native American landscape, talk about the Native peoples that made their home here in Texas and how they dominated Texas. And then we'll dive into what life would be like living in this native-dominated world. So let's say you were transported back in time during the 1700s at a Spanish settlement. We're going to be talking about what your life would likely be like if that were the case. And then finally, if we have the time, it looks like probably not going to have the time, we're going to talk about what happened when the Spanish thought they had more power than the native peoples in Texas. And we're going to learn that they didn't really go all that well for them. Okay. So in early 1770, the monarch of Spain, King Carlos III, he decided he wanted to put together a zoo, a royal zoo. And he wanted this zoo to be the envy of other monarchs in Europe. So what he decided to do was write letters to his high-ranking officials that are scattered across the globe. And these high-ranking officials complied with his demands to send him, I quote, curious pieces for his zoo. And so from Mexico came dragon-like iguanas. From Chile came llamas. And the governor of the Philippines outdid everyone and sent over 3 Asian elephants to Spain. Those elephants would become the crown jewels in this house of beasts, as King Carlos would later term it. But then I want to take us 7 years in the future. 7 years in the future, 1777, King Carlos is walking through his house of beasts. And he's liking what he sees. And he sees that he has a handful of different birds. He has parakeets, he has bats, he has doves, he has macaws. But what he doesn't have are pelicans from the Americas. So he sends another letter to the Viceroy of New Spain, who then forwards that letter to the governor of Texas, who then sends it to a fort on the Texas Gulf Coast known as La Bahia. And at that fort, he demands that the troops go out and capture some American brown pelicans. Now, from my research, what I have uncovered is that these troops simply ignored the command. And that's largely because they understood that while King Carlos looked at his maps back in Spain and saw that Texas was under his control, the reality on the ground was much, much different. The Spanish did not control things in Texas, the native peoples did. And if the Spaniards wanted to go collect those pelicans, they had to go into the Karankawas territory, the Karankawas of the Texas Gulf Coast. And these indigenous peoples did not take intrusions into their territory lightly. And so that's why these soldiers did not want to risk their lives in Indian territory, because they understood their king was a little bit out of touch. So what we're going to be doing today, as I already described, is diving into what life would be like in this native-dominated landscape. And I'm not the first person to talk about Texas being dominated by native peoples. There's a wonderful author, a historian named Juliana Barb, who said as much in her fantastic work, Peace Came in the Form of a Woman. In this work, she demonstrates that when Spaniards came into Texas, they did not come, see, and conquer. In fact, they found themselves to be conquered. They found themselves often paying protection payments just to survive in this locale. So before we dive into what life would be like in Spanish Texas, I need to first provide some context as to the native peoples that made their home in Texas. The first thing I want to bring up is that the native peoples who lived in Texas were incredibly, incredibly diverse. That often when we talk about native peoples in the Lone Star State, we focus on just a handful of indigenous groups. I think that is a large mistake because, as some historians have counted, at first contact, there were over 300 distinct Native American groups, potentially cultures, here in Texas. In fact, Texas is so diverse and its indigenous people that some other scholars believe that Indian Sign Language was developed here in Texas first. There's someone asked a question about that yesterday, and I can follow up more about that in the future. But Indian Sign Language was created here, we think, as a means of communication between all these different peoples that spoke all these different languages. Sign language could bridge those language barriers. In Texas, the Spanish put native peoples in three main categories. The first category is the powerful native peoples, the native peoples that they were the most afraid of. And these groups typically include the Comanches of North Texas, the Wichita peoples of Northeast Texas, the Caddos of East Texas, the Karankawas of the Texas Gulf Coast, the Apaches of Central Texas. And those were mostly the powerful indigenous groups the Spanish were very much concerned with. But there were also other smaller Native American groups that I call intermediary Indians. And these intermediary Indians made their living by going from group to group, native group to the Spanish, trading in information, trading in goods, and sometimes even trading in blows, going to war with these other groups. And these groups would include the Mayais, the Cocos, the Beatais, and so on and so on. There's dozens of these groups. And then the final kind of category that the Spanish would create are the native peoples that are affiliated with them. So there were some Colatecan peoples who viewed the Spanish as wonderful allies. And these Colatecan peoples viewed the Spanish as having a constant source of goods for them to acquire, and the Spanish also had enough military prowess to protect them if need be. For example, these Colatecan people will come to live and be integrated into Spanish society. And some of these Colatecan peoples will be there to help build the Alamo. They'll live alongside the Alamo. They'll be buried in worship in the Alamo. So it's important for us to always recognize their contributions. Now, while some may call that woke history, we historians typically call that accurate history. All right, so while these native peoples were very numerous in Texas, having dozens and dozens of settlements and towns, the Spanish, by comparison, only had 3 major settlements. Now, I am simplifying that to a great extent. There are other smaller Spanish settlements in Texas, like Bucareli and San Saba, but those settlements don't always last that long because they are, again, in native-dominated land. The 3 settlements that do last the test of time are 1, San Antonio, who at this time in the 1700s had a population of around 2,000 people. 2, Nacogdoches, which had a population of around 800 people generally. Currently, the population is around 30,000, and the population in San Antonio is in the millions. And then finally, La Bahia, which is the 3rd settlement on the Texas Gulf Coast. Its population was also around 1,000 at its peak, and today its population is also around 1,000 to 2,000 people. So not much has changed there. So let's say we were transported back to one of these towns. Now, as a quick caveat, I'm going to be focusing more so on San Antonio and La Bahia. While what I'm going to be talking about certainly applies to Nacogdoches, it's important to point out, as it was just pointed out, that the landscape in Nacogdoches was a little bit different because of its proximity to Spanish and French Louisiana. But everything I say today certainly applies to all these settlements, some more than others. All right, so we've been transported back in time to Spanish Texas. We're back there. Now we need to find a way to make a living. We need to find a way to make some money so we can actually survive in this place. Well, the first job prospect we likely will encounter is being a farm hand, helping people grow crops in these settlements. But that's a very difficult and hard job. For one, the agricultural projects that are occurring in Texas are rarely successful. La Bahia, for example, tries to create irrigation systems for decades, and they are not successful in the least. And then the second reason why it's dangerous to be a farm worker is that every time you go out to tend your fields, you're risking being attacked by the dominant native peoples in the area. And there are many different groups who have many different goals. And so being a farmer is not going to pay a lot. You often sometimes even have to ship in corn to survive because Texas is not producing enough. So we're going to skip that job. We don't want to be a farmer. How about we can be a ranch hand and help the mission with its cattle holdings, or help private ranchers and women with their cattle holdings? Well, that job may pay a little bit better than being a farmer, being a farm hand, but it's also incredibly, incredibly dangerous. For one, going out and corralling cattle, branding cattle is also dangerous because the native peoples are always nearby and always threatening. And so that's also something that is considered to be a lower kind of job, a job you don't really always want to have. Okay, what if we want to be a day laborer? Like let's say we don't want to risk our lives going out trying to brand animals. We don't want to risk our lives trying to tend to our crops. We can stay inside of one of these settlements and labor on construction projects or serve as a laborer for someone that's a little bit more wealthy. Well, the issue with this is that these day laborers, their jobs are very inconsistent, that because Texas is so impoverished, there aren't many people who are looking to hire laborers to build things. There is an example, for instance, where the governor needs some laborers to build some municipal buildings for his government. He hires these laborers, and for 8 days, they labor very, very vigorously. Hard work building these municipal buildings. And by the time they are finished, they are paid 2 pesos. Now, to extrapolate that out to today's currency, that'd be around $50. So you can imagine how this is not a very desirable job path. That whenever you do find work, that work is very much underpaid, because imagine yourself in their shoes. Imagine working for 8 days of hard manual labor and you get paid $50 afterward. So those jobs were also jobs that were not all that desirable. But fortunately, there were some tradesmen that made their home here in Texas. For example, you have carpenters, you have blacksmiths, you even have barber surgeons. But they too have to deal with the impoverishment of this location. And they're not getting a lot of jobs because people can't afford often to pay them. As an example, I want us to look at the surgeon who's known as Ildefonso Reyes. Now, Reyes is a barber surgeon that comes from French Louisiana. He'll come over to San Antonio, settle in San Antonio, and he'll make his living tending to the soldiers of the Presidio, also tending to their families, and tending to most of the people in the community, because doctors just generally are very, very sparse in Texas. There's actually no formally trained doctor in Texas throughout the entire Spanish period. Frank de la Teja and myself have been looking for such a trained doctor. We have not located one. Reyes is going to be working in San Antonio, and then one day, 2 residents of San Antonio are going to get into a tussle. And one of them is going to grab a hoe and smash the other's head in with said hoe. Reyes is going to get paid 11 pesos to stitch up that person's head. It's going to take, I think, 18 stitches. He's going to earn another peso and a half for his legal deposition. And so his take-home pay will be essentially the equivalent of $300 today, which shows you how the medical system back then was still better than our medical system today, much cheaper. But even Reyes, making $300 in a single day, still found himself on the precipice of impoverishment because a decade later, he's going to be talking to the governor of Texas, Manuel Munoz, and he is going to say that all he has to his name is his jacal, his hut, his medical equipment, and his clothes. So even being a tradesman in Spanish Texas is not going to bring you a lot of money. It's not a very good job prospect. So with all these jobs being dangerous, being underpaid, you have many different governors and municipal councils posting these ordinances to limit people being vagrants. Because with no one wanting to work because these jobs are so dangerous, a lot of people are lounging around back in San Antonio, back in Nacogdoches, back in La Bahia. And while they're doing so, sometimes they are doing illegal activity like stealing their neighbor's supplies or playing card games or what have you. And so if you read these bandos, you read these ordinances, some of the punishment for being an idler, being a vagrant, could range upwards of having 100 lashes, being hit on your back, to being exiled from the province. Whenever I first read this, I was like, oh my gosh, Spanish Texas is so strict. It's almost like military law, because in many places it was military law. But when you look at things deeper, you realize that things were actually incredibly flexible, and these punishments were never really dished out. I could only encounter in my book 2 or 3 instances in which these punishments were carried out. And most of the time, people were just exiled. They weren't whipped, especially if they were considered to be white or mestizo. If they're indigenous, they were often whipped very frequently. But if they were Hispanicized, they weren't whipped as frequently. And so people, instead of getting in trouble, simply turned to entertainments. And some of these entertainments could be a marble game where they would shoot marbles and hit marbles. Another one would be horseshoes. They called horseshoes, let me find the actual name, I think it's chuzas. I don't quite have it here. They would play horseshoes, and they would also watch cockfights. A really common pastime in Spanish Texas was cockfighting, where you have, interestingly enough, the entire community to come out to these events and watch them. That you would have women there cooking their tortillas and food for the community. You'd also have men there betting on the roosters, and children would be playing while these cockfights are going on. But the most popular form of entertainment when he had no job to do was assuredly playing cards. Now, some of the popular card games during this time was one called 31, which was 31. So think of blackjack, but instead of trying to get to 21, you get to 31. But there was one more card game that was called Chance. That was without a doubt the most played card game. And it was so played, in fact, that we see some governors lamenting that women are staying home and instead of doing their chores or going to work, were playing these games and gambling away their livelihood. So I wanted to take part in that gambling here today. And to demonstrate how to play this game, I was hoping I could have a volunteer just for 10 seconds. And if they are able to beat me, they will win a free version of my book. So I see a volunteers right here. So the game is really, really simple. I'm the house. I'm going to draw a card. And if my card is higher than the card you draw, then I win. But if your card is higher, you win. So it's incredibly, incredibly simple game. This deck is not huge. I haven't looked at your cards. Ask me a bit. Okay, what card is it? It's a 4. I had to eat a board to hear at the sampling game. I got a kid. So you're getting the book. So without a doubt, that was the most played game, and everyone is playing that type of chance. And there's far more details on how it was played, and it got to be a little bit more complex. but I wanted to show y'all exactly how that was played. All right, so we learned about pretty much every job in Spanish Texas, but I purposely left out one job. And this job is the absolute most dangerous job in Texas, but it's also the absolute most desirable job in Texas. And that is being a presidio soldier. Being a soldier at one of these forts that are stationed and kind of positioned on the northern borderline of the Spanish Empire, or their paper empire, as I would like to term it. Being a presidio soldier is dangerous. And that's largely because their death rate is exponentially higher than anything we would have today. For example, the most dangerous job that I could locate today is being a logger. And out of the 100,000 people that were to log, around 1,000, or what is it? Around 100 will die every year. So if you have 100,000 loggers, 100 of those loggers are going to die every year. In my book, I did the same thing for presidio soldiers. If you were a presidio soldier and there was 100,000 of y'all, 10,000 would die every year. So out of 10 people, one person dies every single year. So the question is, why is this job desirable? Why would anyone want to be a presidio soldier? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. The first reason is that it is a steady and secure job, that you as a soldier are stuck in this fort for 10 years. You serve a 10-year stint, and you are paid around 300 pesos every single year. And that pretty much equals around $8,000 a year. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot today because it really isn't a lot, but that is far better than any other job in Spanish Texas. More so, if you're a presidio soldier, the girls tend to like you more. And that's because you are at a higher status, you have a secure job, you're bringing in money, and you have legal protections that most people don't have. By joining the military, you fall under the military's legal jurisdiction. And these military courts, like if you were to break a law, they treat the presidio soldiers, I've found at least, much better than they typically would. So there's all these benefits as to being a presidio soldier. The prime benefit, one of the biggest benefits in my eyes, is that by joining the presidio, if you are a mestizo, if you are mulatto, if you are black, if you are an indigenous person, if you join the presidio, you become white on paper. That in order to join the Crown's army, you had to be white. But there aren't enough Espanol people, there's not enough Spaniards that are up in the northern borderlands who want to go to Texas. Texas is the backwater at this point. And so in order to fill the ranks of the presidio, they begin to recruit people who are indigenous and mestizo. And as soon as you join the military, the roster labels you as an Espanol, as a Spaniard. And so this is a wonderful thing because if you are a lower class person on the casta system, on this hierarchy of races, you can join the military and be viewed as white. And a really great example, which some of y'all may have heard before, involves a 13-year-old girl who is going to marry a 35-year-old man. Now, the relatives of the 13-year-old girl are incredibly upset at this. Not at the fact that a 13-year-old is marrying a 35-year-old, but for the fact that this 13-year-old comes from a military family. Her uncles are serving at the presidio, which makes that family white. And this 13-year-old is being set up to be married to a 35-year-old indigenous man. And that family does not want her to marry an indigenous man because that blood, it would be mixing the blood to the extent where that whiteness would be diluted. But it was common knowledge that the family of that 13-year-old girl were, as the quote goes, mulatto on all four sides, that they themselves were black. But it showed you how by joining the military, you could change your racial status, which is why being a presidio soldier was so desirable. I'm realizing I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to get through the rest of the presentation as timely as possible. But I want to talk about what your daily life would be like as a presidio soldier. If you were a Presidio soldier, you'd wake up in the morning to the crowing of the roosters, to the tolling of the mission bells. You would assemble in the center of the Presidio Plaza, and you'd have a lieutenant or a sergeant that would inspect your clothing, read the crown's royal laws, and then if time permits, you would also do some training exercises. I have a colleague here, Gary Pinkerton, who's in the back, who uncovered that sometimes at these training exercises, they would run out of paper cartridges. And to use replacements, they would pull papers from their archive and use their archival papers to shoot up in their shooting practice. So literally, at times at La Bahia, they would shoot their archive to pieces, which is horrible for us as historians, but it's still interesting nonetheless. These soldiers did all sorts of different duties. They would escort people when they're going out into native land. They would also make sure the mission is not lying about how much cattle it has. They would do so many different things, but probably the most frequented job was the horse herd, protecting the settlement's horse herd. And this is quite the task because the settlement will have thousands of different animals in these corrals, but only around 50 to 100 men in total to try to protect them. And of those 50 to 100 men, only around 20 are at the horse herd. And so frequently, native peoples would sneak up upon these horse herds and steal them very easily. They would wait until it's really dark at night. They would break down some of the corral and they would stampede the horses. And then they would have most of the other native peoples waiting outside to pick out the horses they viewed to be the strongest and the healthiest. And with those horses, they would then go into enemy territory. So, for example, if the Comanches were the ones doing this, they would steal the horses and then go into the territories of the Apaches. That way, when the Spanish traced the horses, they would go to the Apache territory and they would blame the Apaches instead of the Comanches. They would do all sorts of similar things like that. But the horse herd, while it does have moments of incredible adrenaline, would also have moments of extreme boredom. And so you have a lot of these Presidio soldiers, including their wives, who would go and race horses. And they'd race these horses through the streets of San Antonio, through the streets of Goliad. And there were many different ordinances telling women and men to stop their horse races because it was disrupting the community. Another important task was to identify when there were native peoples nearby. And they would try to find if there were native peoples nearby by looking for dust in the air, tracks on the ground, dropped provisions like mescal, arrowheads, vultures in the sky. And there's one example I wanted to provide for y'all. One day, some soldiers are patrolling around the fort and they see tracks. And they get freaked out because there's at least a dozen horse tracks. They're not from their own horses. So they go back to the Presidio. They round up a big group of Presidio soldiers to track them down. And when they get there, they realize that they just encountered some Apaches who have killed a bison and are butchering the bison. And the reason why I told this story is not because it's filled with action, but because it demonstrates just how paranoid life is on the Spanish frontier. That these Presidio soldiers at all times are frequently thinking they're going to be attacked by native peoples. And anytime they see a sign of native peoples, they feel incredibly threatened. Now, we don't have time to get into all of this. I'm going to wrap up really quickly. But there'll be a point at which the Spaniards think things have shifted, and they'll decide they want to go to war with the Karankawa peoples of the Texas Gulf Coast. They think they have better weapons. They think they have more people. They think they have better strategies. They want to wipe out the Karankawas of the Texas Gulf Coast. We don't have time to read too much, but I'll just let you know things do not go well at all. In fact, they go so poorly that in multiple points throughout the Karankawa Spanish War, as I term it, the Spanish think about completely abandoning most of their settlements in Texas. That's how out of reach they are to the native peoples. So to wrap things up, it's important to point out that from the very beginning, native peoples were the ones dominating Texas. And the Hispanic people had to live in their world to survive. But survive they did. In fact, they would continue to thrive all the way up until around 1810 and 11, when war would reach them and a certain battle known as the Battle of Medina would decimate the Spanish Texas population. Thank you so much.
Do we have any questions?
I totally forgot about that aspect.
Is there any truth to the Karankawas being cannibals?
It's a great question. So I've tackled this question a number of times before. I'm going to tell you my perspective, and I'm going to tell you some Indigenous people's perspectives. My perspective from the historical sources I've seen is that Native peoples in Texas did in fact practice cannibalism. We see that practice really fall off by the end of the 1700s. The Karankawas, I think, assuredly did practice a very ritualistic and strict form of cannibalism. They would only cannibalize their ancient enemies, as they called them, and they would only do so after that person was dead. But that practice very much falls off. It's also important to point out that at the time where these Native peoples are practicing very, very limited form of cannibalism, there's a much greater form of cannibalism going on in Europe. The Europeans are practicing medicinal cannibalism. Well, they'll go to the apothecary if they had a headache. They'll find some ground up human skulls and they'll ingest those skulls. So cannibalism is far more common than we expect. What Indigenous people would tell you, and this is absolutely valid, is that Europeans and colonizers use these claims of cannibalism to commit exterminations, in my eyes, commit genocide against the Karankawas. So I'm really, really glad you asked that question because it is a tricky one to answer, but I think that's the best answer I could give.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks. I just had to.
Oh. Okay.
I just had a quick question on the Presidio soldiers. Were they expected to provide their own horses, or were that something provided by the crown?
It's a great question. I think the crown had a requirement that they had to have 3 horses. I am totally blanking. I mean, I wrote a whole book on it. I have to look at my book, but I'm like totally blanking on whether or not they were. Thank you. Maybe Joaquin would know. I don't think so. I think Presidio soldiers technically had to provide their own horses. They had to have 3 horses.
I was supposed to I saw this time.
They have a digs. So, I mean, I know that is such a thing is they, for instance, inside a penny make where all the autos use and push for the city of the people may rap.
Yeah,
But that wasn't necessarily the case. Where he
I think that's a great answer. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joaquin.
Thank you so much, Tim. Oh.
We only had time for one more question.